It's Latin America's largest country and largest economy, yet it's suffering an economic crisis like never seen before in the Southern American continent, with COVID-19 now placing Brazil second only after the U.S. in terms of infections. With well over 1 million, can the Brazilian economy cope with the pressure? But has the economy slumped because of the actions of just one man? The Brazilian President Jair Bolsanaro was a leading voice of the anti-lockdown measures in his own country, but it seems that his actions have returned to haunt him.
The economic results from the pandemic in Brazil are going to be catastrophic. It's going to be horrible. We are talking about 9% of recession, but it's probably going to be even worse because it's going to take a long time. And it's not just isolation, it's not just lockdowns that are causing that, because even though everything's closed now, we still have a pandemic. And even if you open everything tomorrow, people are not going to just to go back to normal life as it was before. People are going to avoid crowds, people are going to avoid shops, and people are worried about the economy. So they are turning back from consumption.
But for others, the lack of income, the desire to get back to opening their businesses means that they are actually fully behind the actions of Jair Bolsonaro in opposing the closing of the shops, restaurants, and other places of businesses.
Em apoio ao nosso presidente Jair Messias Bolsonaro, queremos voltar ao trabalho, queremos apoio aos comerciantes, apoio aos empresários. Esse povo aqui em São Paulo hoje é em apoio ao Brasil, que volte ao trabalho, que quarentena sim, somente a vertical, horizontal não apoiamos. E as pessoas que tiverem problema de saúde acima de 60 anos, fiquem em casa.
Hello, welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavita Hui. In this week's episode, we will be looking at the Brazilian economy and how it has struggled to deal with the impact of the coronavirus, as well as looking at how the rich and the poor divide in Brazil is growing wider than ever. Now, don't forget, we want to hear your stories on this or any other topic, so make sure that you take a few minutes to check out our Twitter page using the marker @ED_program. Feel free to drop us a line, tag us in a photo, or share your experiences. We'd be happy to hear from you. Now, Brazil has taken the second spot on the list of countries affected by COVID-19, with figures of infected people exceeding 1.1 million, with sadly over 50,000 succumbing to the disease. With a daily death rate of over 1,000 people, many fear that with a population of over 200 million, the true figures could be much worse. With a GDP of just over $2 trillion, Brazil is the world's 8th largest economy, with commodities such as the service sector, industry, and agriculture being major contributors. But current events have led to a 1.5% drop in GDP for the first quarter, with the World Bank suggesting this could fall to around 5% by the end of the year. Now, looking at the GDP figures, if we take a look at the breakdown of the figures, we can see why the impact of COVID-19 is having such a wide effect on the people, as the service industry, which employs most of the workforce, accounts for some 67% of the GDP. The industrial sector comes in second with 27.5%, and agriculture 5.5%, all of which are very human-oriented sectors, and hence why the situation is dire for Bolsonaro.
As the wave of the coronavirus swept across the world, the South American plateau appeared to be the last to be hit, until that as Brazil started to report its first cases. Within a swift few months, Brazil saw both its infection rate and its death rate come second only to the United States, with over 1.3 million people infected and figures approaching 60,000 deaths. The handling of the situation by the Brazilian authorities has raised eyebrows both within Brazil and around the world. Many have questioned as to why the situation spiraled out of hand, with many fingers pointing towards Jair Bolsonaro's policy of resisting the lockdowns, which saw the rest of the world attempt to contain the disease at the expense of the economy, and was something that Bolsonaro openly flouted in his leadership.
The fact that Bolsonaro is against lockdowns, is against quarantines, is against isolation, has been problematic because some people are just ignoring the government rules. So you see people on the streets without masks, you see people going to parties, and you see people complaining about science and not believing science. And that's the biggest problem of what Bolsonaro is doing.
In spite of many places in Brazil trying to maintain a lockdown in order to protect themselves, many retail stores and places of business have started to reopen, meaning the risk of a pandemic increasing further has not gone away, with a third of the population of Brazil openly behind the policies of Bolsonaro, meaning that the exponential infection curve is still growing. One of the potential reasons for the spread of the virus getting out of hand is the notion that in certain metropolitan areas, the population density is extremely high, and with the likes of Rio and Sao Paulo having both compacted areas of residential areas, it's easy to see. One such example of which are the cramped and close quarters of the infamous favelas, where both social distancing and access to medical facilities can be hard to come by, hence contributing to the overall rise in figures.
One of the most famous components of Brazilian life are the infamous favelas in the city of Rio de Janeiro, which houses some 1.5 million people, and that's around 25% of the population of the city, and overall a major contributor to the economy. In fact, of the 12 million people living in favelas across Brazil, the overall income generated by the so-called lower-class residents of the country equates to some $7.5 billion US dollars. That's equivalent to the GDP of Tajikistan, if you can believe that. Now, the people living in the favelas in the year 2001, according to the percentage, you have some 60% of the residents who are classified as lower-class citizens, with 37% in the so-called middle class. Yet by the year 2013, 32% were considered lower class, with 65% being considered as middle class, showing that the working class of Brazil were able to escape their social labels and thrive.
Poverty is a problem across the world, with clear rich and poor divides between classes, with a clear indication that middle classes are slowly fading away as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Brazil's no exception. Current figures show that poverty is on the rise in Brazil, with extreme poverty rising from 6.6% of the population to 7.2%, equating to some 15.2 million people. Living conditions in some parts of Brazil have been shown to find that some 27 million people, or around 13% of the population, lived in homes missing essential characteristics, coming in with a poor rating when considering occupancy conditions, access to services, physical characteristics, and the availability of goods in the household. There was, however, a period in which poverty in Brazil was being eliminated and saw some 15 million people lifted out of poverty. But now, all of that has changed. With extreme poverty come extreme methods of survival, and unfortunately for Brazil, some of the poorer areas have significantly higher crime rates, with the favelas well known for their drug-related crime issues, resulting in gang warfare and murder in some cases. In order for the high crime rate to be controlled in such a volatile area, heavily armed police and even the military have been deployed to contain the problem, which creates further tension in an already struggling area.
Ontem teve operação no morro, eles levaram 2 presos, mataram 2. Acho que haveria necessidade de ele voltar hoje para fazer outra operação, para deixar mais uma vítima. Hoje tem enterro de 2, amanhã vai ter enterro de mais 1. Até quando vai ser isso?
But like any other place in the world where concentrated poverty are common ground, the ability to escape from the situation is very difficult, with lack of education and jobs being a major factor in assisting people out of poverty, hence creating a very vicious circle.
Joining me in the studio is Alfredo Sadfilo, a professor of development studies from King's College, London. He specializes in the political economy of development, industrial policy, neoliberalism, and alternative economic policies. Professor, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, first up, the Brazilian economy, it has taken a major hit over the last few months, partly caused by the COVID-19 outbreak. Why do you think this has affected Brazil so badly?
The Brazilian economy has been going through the most severe economic crisis in recorded history for that country. The IMF has recently updated its prediction and suggests that the Brazilian economy will contract by 9.1% this year. This is a severe hit. So you take an economy that is already fragile from the balance of payments point of view, fragile because it imports too much, fragile because it's been going through an accelerated process of deindustrialization sponsored by the state, in a context of a global economy that is in its deepest crisis since 1929. And that's what you find, a government that is unable to address the most severe symptoms of the crisis, and a population that is in dire need of different forms of economic and financial support. This is an unmitigated disaster that is taking place in Brazil at the moment.
Next question, how do you think Jair Bolsonaro has handled the economy? Do you think his relationships with other countries like the U.S. are actually healthy for the Brazilian economy?
No, they're not healthy at all. Jair Bolsonaro has been absolutely appalling in terms of defending Brazil's interests in the international sphere. It is a shocking spectacle to see someone who, in exchange for nothing, this is the worst kind of diplomacy you can imagine, in exchange for nothing simply follows whatever suggestions Donald Trump has to offer. The most dramatic example, of course, is the hydroxychloroquine, something that Trump defended. Bolsonaro jumped in immediately after, started defending hydroxychloroquine as well. Eventually, when it was shown that it does not work, then at that point, Brazil imported 2 million doses of hydroxychloroquine from the United States.
Final question, has the economic divide between the rich and the poor in Brazil widened since the economic crisis? We're looking at reports that said up to 15 million people were lifted out of poverty. Is that still the case?
This was the case between 2003 approximately and 2012 or 2013. But the economic crisis caught Brazil about that time when the global commodity boom evaporated. It came to an end. And then the resources to lift people out of poverty in one of the largest countries in the world, in one of the countries with the worst income distribution in the world, the resources simply dried up. And with that, the improvements in distribution of income and the improvements in lifting people out of extreme poverty that had been almost completely eradicated in Brazil. It's a middle-income country. It does have resources to lift people out of poverty. But those resources dried up, and the political will dried up as well.
Okay, Professor Alfredo Sadfilo from King's College, many thanks for being with us today here on Economic Divide.
Thank you so much.
Professor, with his comments there. Okay, we're about to take a quick break here on Economic Divide. Don't go anywhere, as we have plenty more coming up. We're going to take a look at how the indigenous people of the Brazilian Amazon are being waved aside by logging and mining companies, and how the rainforest is suffering. Also look at how Bolsonaro's relationship with the U.S. and other nations, and ascertain whether this is playing a part in the Brazilian economy. We're also going to be joined by Mahan Abedin, our current affairs and impact analyst, and have his take on how Brazil is doing. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Time to take a look at other economic news happening around the world, starting with multinational chemical company Bayer, who has just won a case overruling a requirement to label the products as carcinogenic on the labels. Is this not a case of money over health? Well, the CEO of payment firm Wirecard has been arrested in Germany following a 1.9 billion euro deficit in the books, the sum which equates to about a quarter of the firm's full value. The rest comes after the company fraudulently misled investors into the true value of the company. With Virgin Atlantic suffering huge losses in the aviation industry, its sister company, Virgin Galactic, has signed a deal with NASA offering space tourism and private funded space missions, hence giving the first real notion of competition to Elon Musk's SpaceX program. And finally, with Black Lives Matter gaining strength across the world, global brands are now backing the movements, with the likes of Netflix, Disney, Hulu, Apple Music, and Nike all endorsing the protest that saw the death of George Floyd. However, is this merely a marketing ploy? Well, now let's take a look at how Brazil's relations with other nations may be having an effect on the Brazilian economy.
Brazil is a vast country, in fact, the 5th largest nation in the world, behind the US and ahead of Australia. It's also home to the world's 2nd longest but largest water flow river, the Amazon. Furthermore, Brazil is home to the world's largest rainforests, in fact, larger than the next 2 forests combined, meaning that the 6.9 million square kilometre jungle is roughly twice the size of India. With such a plentiful and diverse range of natural resources, it's no wonder that Brazil is the world's 8th largest economy, and hence why so many mining and logging companies want to take a slice of the profits, including companies from Brazil.
The first point I would say is we should not only blame international companies that are interested in the mining in Brazil. We should not forget that Vale, the Brazilian company, it is probably one of the biggest mining companies in the world, and it is originally from Brazil. Brazilian Amazonia specifically, it's known to have one of the most rich biodiversity, but also mineral resources, unexploited still. The survey of the Amazonian region scientifically proved that it's very rich in several minerals, since those more sophisticated use for technological industry to the iron minerals that are necessary for a more simple industry.
Logging is also a major factor contributing to the Brazilian economy, which kills 2 birds with 1 stone, as both the wood is sold and the land that is stripped is made available for cattle and agriculture. However, deforestation is a major issue troubling both the Amazon and the planet in general, with 20% of forests already stripped bare, continuing at a rate of around 52,000 square kilometres per year. It's not just the Amazon forest itself that's suffering from this, but also the indigenous people of Brazil, who are seeing their land stripped away before them. For some of those tribes affected, contact with the outside world has become the normal, but it's still believed that there are around 50 to 100 uncontacted tribes left, all of whom are now at risk of losing their culture, their heritage, and their land. However, things are starting to change, and Brazil, for one, is using its military to protect what's remaining of the Amazon, with logging and deforestation actually in decline, leaving only some illegal operations, which are being cracked down on.
In the beginning of this year, as a result of the last year deforestation rate and especially the fires of the Amazonian, Brazilian government create what they call the Operação Verde Brasil, Operation Green Brazil. And what is interesting about this operation is that again, armed forces had been deployed as the main form of policing of the region. So there is a massive deployment of military tackling illegal crimes on the environmental issue in the Amazon right now, addressing questions of logging, illegal mining, supporting other agencies like the environmental agency in Brazil, IBAMA, or the federal police that has the direct responsibility to track this sort of crime.
Hello, welcome back to Economic Divide. Joining me in the studio now is Mahan Abedin, a current affairs and impact analyst. Mahan, thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.
Looking at Brazil and not looking good for them, obviously, like many countries.
Yes.
What's your first entry all about?
Well, obviously, this is a country very hard hit by the pandemic, but the economic news is not good either, I'm afraid. 11% of GDP fallen, economy set to shrink by 7%, and this is all set against the backdrop of pretty terrible economic news prior to COVID. There's an airline deal that fell through in Brau, one of the biggest employers in Brazil, a huge aviation industry that's even involved in the military sphere. So the economic news was not good immediately prior to COVID-19. And the latest figures just explain describe to what extent the economy has
shrank.
But
even before COVID-19 hits, if we take a look at the next century from what you chose, Brazil was not doing that well.
Indeed. So in a few years, if we go back a few years...
We can take a look at the next century
indeed,
before we continue with this.
Sure. So Brazil's economy, according to many fact sheets, hadn't grown much since 2014. So even if you take a longer view back, going back 5 or 6 years, this was an economy that was already struggling. So, there you go, stuck at the same level as in 2014. And then you must set this against the wide-scale expectation for the past decade or two that Brazil is really the up-and-coming economy, is one of the emerging economies, is going to potentially compete with the big beasts of the economic world, the Americas, the Japans. So this news is not good, I'm afraid.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. We appreciate it.
You're
Maan
welcome.
Abedin, our current affairs and impact analyst. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back.
National perception is something that Brazil, arguably above many other nations in the world, is renowned for. One only has to hear the word Brazil and the images of football greats appear, carnivals in Rio, the Copacabana beach, and of course the rainforest, all spring to mind. However, on a political scale, things are very different. The incumbent president, Jair Bolsanaro, has changed the political perception of Brazil from being a fairly non-aligned country to one that has snuggled up closely to the policies and practices of Donald Trump and the United States, with talk hovering about as having Brazil become a non-member ally of NATO. So could the alignment to the US bring more economical and political sway to the country? It's something that's questioned very carefully.
A country that was known historically for a more multilateral approach to a more collaborative approach globally suddenly turns into a sort of mirror of US foreign policy. So I think the consequences in long term for Brazil will be not as favorable as some people would think that could be.
It's not just the political perception that Brazil has to face. It's also the fact that as it moves up the ladder in terms of infections and death rates due to COVID-19, so too does the negative awareness from other countries around the world.
Perception is a problem for Brazil. And we are seeing that now with the COVID-19 pandemic. We see countries that are talking about closing borders for Brazilian citizens. The US has already done that. We are very close to the US now with Bolsonaro in the government, but they are blocking entry from Brazilian citizens. Europe has been talking about that as well. So in the long term, if we see Europe and the US and the rest of the world starting to reopen and starting to control the pandemic, if we don't do that in Brazil, and if we are seen from the outside as a country who cannot control the pandemic and has become the epicenter of it, we are going to pay for that.
What now remains to be seen is whether both Trump and Bolsonaro win another term in office, and if they don't, will the Brazilian mirror imaging of the US fade away and return Brazil to a multilateral form of foreign policy and trade?
Brazil is a key member of the BRICS nation, which makes an important and powerful economy to take notice of. However, the clear mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic appears to have taken its toll on the country, with the actions of President Bolsonaro reflecting those of his close friend Donald Trump, who equally failed at dealing with the pandemic. The people of Brazil are also suffering from the decisions of Bolsonaro, with many indigenous tribes and rural areas of the massive nation also succumbing to the COVID-19 outbreak, meaning that many of them have little or no access to healthcare systems. Furthermore, Brazil's Amazon rainforest has been described as the lungs of the earth, providing much needed air, filtering and oxygen to the planet, yet it is being torn down at an alarming rate. That just about does it for this week's show, but don't forget you can watch this episode and all of our previous episodes online by visiting our website. You can also reach out to us via our Twitter page, @ED_program. We'd love to hear what you have to say. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed the show. On behalf of myself, Kaveh Tahway, and the rest of the team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.